This is Hardiguards and the Holy Mountain, written by Alan H. Shari, narrated by Leroy Hall. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Cave. Everyone exposed to the yellowish, sticky fog hanging over the town felt sick and uncomfortable, except Ace, who relaxed outdoors in the hammock. Around noon, the troubling haze preparing the only sufficient element, sunlight, for basking. When he succumbed to thirst, he rolled over and yanked the vase beside him. He drank all the water in one go and dropped the vase near a pot. This was a full 2 hours ago. Finding it hard to keep his eyes open, Ace prepared himself to take a nap in the beautiful weather. The pleasant sunshine and cool breeze made him sluggish. Even the annoying red fly buzzing around his head didn't bother him at all. With each gust, the hammock moved a little bit and prepared him for the second round. But his joy faded when he noticed a sudden chill on his face. Someone stood next to him, blocking the sunlight. Suddenly, a bowl of water splashing his face sent a sudden shock through his whole being. It was Ina, Ace's older sister. She was toned and tall, a powerful frame with an extra layer of muscle. The strong, athletic body left no doubt about her career. Ina stared at Ace, expecting him to leap out of the hammock right away. However, she didn't see any sign of movement, except for his dangling right leg. Even the pesky fly had a chance to maneuver around in his open mouth.
"Get up! You didn't forget, did you? The one you brought last time didn't taste good. It was crude and unappealing,"
Ina shouted. Ace swatted the fly on his wet face and remained calm to prove he had everything under control. He knew why she stood there, but stared back at her obliviously.
"Why is it always my turn? I just brought a bunch recently. I'm busy, and this is the last thing that you can do,"
Ina interrupted, heaving a deep sigh.
"Our neighbors have complained about your last delivery. Do your job well, and let others be happy. Where are you going now?" "I'm busy. I'm taking the students for climbing practice on the towers. You should leave now before it gets dark."
She didn't even let him come up with an excuse. Shaking his head and shutting his eyes, he enjoyed the last few seconds of relaxation. Ace was one of the thousands of Hardiguards living on the planet. Hardiguards were two-legged creatures with strong, colossal bodies. Layers of scale covered their skin, protecting them like a knight's shield. Their ability to talk, think, and use their hands had made them the most rational beings on the planet. Without a doubt, they stood out superior from all other species. Since it was better to be on his way before he heard more complaints, Ace rose from the hammock and stretched. His attempt led him to stumble over the empty pot and vase. A brownish loincloth stamped with an 8-legged creature was the only thing he had worn. Ace tightened his brownish armor, which was almost falling, and set off for the sea. As the young Hardiguard found himself alongside the fort's wall, he realized the absence of the required tools. Ace thought about whether he should try to retrieve them, but he remembered what happened the last time he didn't have the tools. Besides, he had already put in some effort to be at that point, and didn't want to waste it. Near their town were a dense jungle and a beautiful sea that at times were wild and dangerous. Ace walked around the houses and up the road, arriving at the trading crowds. Tables sold fish, meat, fruits, herbs, skins, cloths, and tools. Money didn't exist. The town subsisted on commodity exchange as the only way to trade. The hubbub of negotiations filled the market, making it difficult to pick anything out. Ace had to pass through the crowd by pushing through every available gap. As he impatiently cut them off, he almost collided with a man who was fat around his waist and short enough to not be seen among the crowd. He had burnished silver scales with a tiny grey wattle that stuck out from the top of his head. He held a basket of strange-looking stones.
"Watch out, boy! You don't want to walk over me and break my valuable stones," he shouted.
The man took a deep breath and groaned.
"Do you want some juicy stones? I need to exchange them for tools or meat."
He looked unblinkingly up at Ace, and with his left hand, he wiped away the drool dangling in a sticky rope from his lips.
No thanks. I've neither tools nor meat,"
Ace replied, and kept walking before another vendor stopped him. Tapping the fruits gently in the baskets and flicking the insects sitting on the vegetables, Ace got close to the gardens and farms until he reached the main door of the fort. Cautiously, he walked through a small meadow. Attracting wild animals would cause serious problems. On his way, he passed over a short hill until he found himself at the beach. The eastern towers were visible from his spot. Ina stood on one of them, instructing students on the wall. Ace turned left and right to look for their boat, but he couldn't find it. A lot of boats rested down on the sand, as if no one had moved them for decades. Shrugging, he wondered which one belonged to him.
"Your boat is the one at the corner with a pile of stones on it, Ace,"
said a hoarse voice. Turning around, he saw two fishermen emptying their nets. He grinned at them. They didn't look gratified, because their nets seemed empty.
"How is your dad, boy?"
one fisherman asked, holding a bag of transparent fish with 4 tiny feet barely visible.
"He's fine. Thanks for asking,"
Ace replied while tracing his finger, which pointed to the boat lying upside down, waiting for his attention. After a moment, Ace turned back to them.
"As usual, he's busy with curiosity and too concerned with educating people." "He knows what he's doing. He's dedicating all his time to the community,"
the fisherman shouted and kept emptying the net.
"Yes, he is."
Ace whirled toward the boat, put his hand on his waist, and let out a deep sigh. After a while, he took the stones off and pulled it into the sea. Why should I do this? I need to enjoy this beautiful weather we rarely ever get. Ace was tall and skinny. His eyes were light blue, with black vertical slit pupils, and his muscular jaw outlined a rough face. He had colorful spots on his body, but golden brawn dominated. A dark mark with a bright line grew from his forehead to his back and gradually faded away. He also had a gradient line under his chin and down to his chest. As soon as Ace passed the shallow part of the sea, he jumped into the boat, rowed until he broke the waves, and went toward the cliff at the bottom part of the holy mountain. Dense fog always hovered over the top part of the mountain, and no one knew why. A sacred place they avoided climbing. The holy mountain soared above all 3 cities. The only spot that people could get close to was at the foothills of the mountain, where a large piece of square rock called the platform was located. The wisest man, Alex, was buried there many years ago. During special days, they prayed there, brought food, and sacrificed animals while wearing a unique costume that Alex used to wear. Finally, Ace got close to the cliff, enjoying the sunshine and the humidity. As a sign of being an adult, small, dark blue horns had popped out of his shoulders. The dew on his tiny horns and the rest of his body made him glow in the sun. Plenty of moss grew on half the mountain at the seaside. It created a colorful rug. The water was clear as glass, a perfect spot for diving. It got windy, so he hurried to get the seaweed or any slow creatures in hopes of enjoying the pleasant weather before sunset. Since hunting was perilous, Hardiguards avoided it as much as they could. They had lost many people because of this practice. They considered catching sea creatures and plants the best alternative to get food. Ace's family and 4 neighbors had agreed to alternate in providing seafood each day. Ace stopped rowing and crawled toward the gunwale. The 2 fishermen's boat also moved toward the northern islands, catching more fish. Taking a deep breath, he jumped out of the boat and swam. It didn't take long before he reached the lower depths. His sudden movements scared the resting sea creatures. Ace glanced around to search for the most delicious blue seaweed. By good fortune, a large sway glided on the seabed. He grasped and pulled the marine plants with all his might, but they were like trees rooted to the ground. It was harder than he thought. It seemed he needed the simple but practical tool he had forgotten to grab. Just 2 wooden bars joined through a chain. No other options remained except lowering his expectations and, of course, disappointing other people. He went to the young groups popping out among the rocks. They looked tiny and gentle, suitable for his bare hands. When he had enough to bring home, the happy Hardiguard went back to the boat and loaded them. "There's still room, and I can get more," he thought as he got in, thinking of how everyone loved to send him there whenever they saw him enjoying the sunny weather. Perhaps bringing more than they asked could spare for a few more days of relaxing. But when he got ready to dive back into the sea, he heard a piercing sound, and then a bright light beamed at a far distance with a silent, billowing cloud aloft in black and white. The disaster spread majestically over the water in a flower-shaped form, rumbled vehemently, and broke all silence and solitude of the sea's beauty. He knew what he had witnessed delivered bad news. Once in a while, sea explosions occurred in the area. It was both a blessing to provide enough heat and misery to destroy the surroundings. Always, some people gave thanks and some complained. At that moment, the young man belonged to the second category. As the colorful splashing water, tall as a mountain, appeared from a distance, Ace saw a giant, furious and destructive wave approaching him. His muscles had frozen in place. There was no running away. His mouth fell open in horror.
"Oh, not now! What should I do? Where should I go?"
The terrified young man looked at the coastline. Ina ran fast toward the cliff. She waved her right hand to tell him something. Ace narrowed his eyes to capture the signal, still far, he thought, and glimpsed at the wave, and then the boat, and again his sister.
"Use your hands and legs properly to grab and climb. The tiny sticky hair on the tips of your finger and toes turns you into a great climber. You need to focus on controlling your fingers and toes on time," Ina told the students. All of them stood at the nearest tower on the beach side. Each student wore a climbing harness, ready to start the ideal practice to spur their climbing abilities. The main instructor, Ina, went ahead without a rope, ready to begin the practical lesson with her head down. The sea, perfectly calm, was like a peaceful lake, and its soft murmurs were scarcely audible. Ina directed their attention to her hands and feet. The salty taste of the air on her tongue and the pleasant scent of the sea in her nostrils didn't last long. Her gaze was drawn toward the sea, where the blinding light appeared. She felt another pulse of worry by feeling the intense pressure from the light. She looked back at the other instructors on the tower. "Take everyone down and try to help those fishermen on the boat."
Ina didn't wait for their confirmation and crawled down the tower in a flash. Her muscles stretched, forcing her legs to push harder. Her heart pounded to the beat of her feet running over the soft surface. Sprinting on the coastline like an arrow splitting the wind, she fixed her eyes on the gigantic wave. Sweat beaded her forehead. She didn't know where Ace was, nor did she know how to save him. All she knew was she had to keep running forward, not stopping for anything. As she saw Ace's head, she waved her right hand and shouted,
"Go down! Grab onto something heavy!"
Ace concluded that his sister only tried to warn him about the danger behind him. He looked at his boat again, imagining himself sitting in it and rowing fast toward the beach. Despite that thought, he looked at the fisherman's boat, taking a deep breath instead, and he swam as fast as he could to the bottom of the sea where the rocks were set. It required more energy to swim to the side or bottom. Because of the explosion, the current pushed him back. He reached the rocks and checked around for protection. At any moment, the wave would come for him, and he kept looking for an ideal spot. His heart fluttered. He found something nearby with a good hold. Ace slid back quick as possible and held the protruding edges with his hands while cuddling the rock with his legs for more stability. He waited anxiously for the coming of the destructive wave. As the wave drew closer and closer, he kept his position with closed eyes, hoping the rock where he took refuge could help him survive the unexpected chaos. It arrived and swept the seabed. The violent upsurge pulled the stone as if it knew Ace hid there. After a few moments of resistance, he lost his grip and found himself suspended in the water, beaten by the rocks several times until he fell unconscious. Ace was motionless, lying down nowhere, it seemed. He wasn't sure if he were dead or alive, in a total blackout. His mind was awake, but he could neither move nor hear or see anything. Am I dead? He thought. He tried to open his eyes, but couldn't until he tasted the sweet drops of moss falling over his face and filling his mouth. With a low cough, he threw up the water that invaded his lungs. It was painful, but after deep, constant coughing, he was relieved of the water. His scales contracted. He was locked by the immune system, making him unable to move even a single inch of his muscles. During a massive attack, horror, or severe anxiety, a Hardiguard's body reacted in such ways. Breathing tortured him at the moment. Ace opened his eyes. Everything blinked and turned around. He had no idea where he was. Colorful lights glimmered. After a while, he managed to keep his eyes open. Blinking and contemplating his whereabouts, he saw the lights surrounding him. Where am I? After a long moment, his scales settled down and relaxed. Ace pulled himself up and sat upright on the floor where he could recline against the moss-covered wall. He was sure he had not seen it before. As he looked around, he found himself captivated by the beauty of the vibrant cave. Water splashed everywhere. Small, loose stones littered the floor. The gleaming moss was embedded in the cave's walls and ceilings. Maybe I've been chosen by the mountain. Maybe this is the top of the mountain and I'm just experiencing a test. Ace kept guessing, engrossed in his dream, until he felt pain everywhere. He lifted his hand and, panic-stricken, stared at his finger. A deep cut on his right shoulder dragged him down in a total state of weakness and discomfort. He paused for a minute, cautiously holding himself together, taking refuge on the rocky wall. How long have I been here? Staring at the beauty of the cave, he felt the secretions of the glowing vines on the wall dropping on him and directly touching his wounds. He gasped at the sudden sensation, but eventually discovered that it soothed his lacerations. Surprised and intrigued, Ace gently brushed the moss, and the fantastic fresh substance made his hand glow. Oh, what is this? With his hand still gleaming, Ace stood up and kept walking to find his way out. Also, the ragged and protruding stones covered by moss blocked the view. Ace had to move around by following the damp moss with his hands. His attempt led him to a dead end. There must be a way out. I cannot be under the water either. But how am I able to breathe then? In the hope of finding an opening, he kept searching. I wish someone could tell me where I am. He pushed his injured body against every wall, believing he could find a way out. Help! Help! Is anyone here? I'm in the cave! Help! Help! He shouted in vain. He kept pushing the different sides of the wall for a while, until he eventually got tired and leaned against the moss. Help me! Help! The hope of being heard faded away very soon. Holding his right hand with an aching index finger, Ace sat in the corner of the cave for a long moment. The cave was utterly beautiful. 2 clear streams were rolling down the cave's wall and found their way into a pond. But how could he appreciate the view if he was worried about his survival? He was not alone. Some black beetles with metallic shells feasted on the remains of a fish. Ace fixed his eyes on the fish bones. With gritted teeth, he thought he could end up being eaten by them, piece by piece. The flickering lights from the fireflies made him dizzy. He felt frail and hungry. The only things he could eat now were the weeds nestled in the pond. Ace dragged himself forward and picked up a mound of them. Trying to soothe his empty stomach, he ate a mouthful and found himself choking. His first instinct told him to bow down at the edge of the pond to drink some water from one of the streams, but he slipped and fell headfirst into the water. Ace was in a panic, but it didn't take so long to realize that the pond was not deep. He stood up, and almost 2/3 of his body, up to his chest, remained submerged in the water. He swallowed the weeds and noticed a channel ahead of him when he sat. Ace hesitated to move forward, yet it offered the only glimmer of hope he could count on in that condition. He decided to check out the jagged and uneven channel. He slid through it until he reached the end, discovering another tunnel down that headed straight to the open sea. Thank goodness! Taking a deep breath, he reached above sea level and felt relieved. Ace was still close to the holy mountain, but he was now on the other side. The wave caused by the explosion had pushed the rocks and opened the channel that threw him to the cave. Glancing around, he searched for his boat. Soon enough, he concluded the boat had met a similar destiny, or maybe worse, after the formidable explosion. Ace swam to the coast. He was not far from the seashore, but had to stop and take breaths because of his exhausted state. Broken trees and leaves floated in the water. Also, drifting bits of wood bobbing around him showed how far the surge had damaged the coastline. His physical condition slowed him down to the point the lifeless branch next to him seemed to be moving faster. He felt pain, yet he had no other choice but to swim for his survival. After a long swim, he reached a shallow part of the water and got out. At a slow pace, he headed for the coastline. The wave had left massive destruction in the area. The whole place was awash. The seashore was in a complete mess, as if the entire place was invaded by vultures that devoured the flesh of the dead animals. Scattered fish lay lifeless on the sand. His stomach rumbled with hunger. Ace had eaten nothing since he left the house, except for the seaweed that was close to choking him. He sat on the driftwood for a while to gather his thoughts and strength. One after the other, the crashing waves lashed against the cliff, rolling over the beach, leaving its lacy foam. Setting his feet under the silky sand, he felt its warmth and let it tickle his toes. The pain that plagued him for a long time disappeared, and he forgot his hunger too. Ace stood up and began walking toward the town. As he kept shuffling his feet on the sand, he saw a crowd in the distance. One of the people pointed at him. Ace raised his hand for help. The group ran over and huddled together around him. A tall, muscular young male named Raxon reached him first.
Finally, we found you, boy. We've been looking everywhere. Different teams searched for you in the sea and the jungle after the explosion,
he said anxiously. Everyone continued asking him about his whereabouts and how he survived the incident.
We couldn't find Ina and the 2 fishermen. She came to save you. Where have you been?
Raxon whispered, and even anticipated his answer. Ace could guess what had happened to the fishermen. He remembered the last time he saw his sister around the cliff. She was running and waving at him. He had no idea what happened to her, but he could still remember struggling against the current and the moment he opened his eyes to find himself in the majestic cave. Instead, he thought they might misconstrue his courageousness if they knew about the cave. The hero of the explosion made up his mind.
I don't know,
he lied.
I guess I was just lucky. The wave threw me over to the other side of the holy mountain. But before the wave, I saw Ina near the cliff.
Indeed, you are lucky, Raxon replied. You must have a strong build. No one has been able to survive that kind of tragedy before, he added, and others confirmed the tragic fact.
Yeah, Raxon is right. I think Ina is fine too. She is stronger than that wave,
asserted another fellow with a large, long mouth.
We've been doing rituals and food sacrifices to the holy mountain since the first sea explosion happened. Perhaps the power of the mountain protected you.
Raxon told Tyler, a young boy. Go and let Z know about Ace's condition. We need him to be ready. He left the crowd and ran as fast as he could. Debris and pools of water were everywhere as they headed home. When Janet saw the people, she ran to them. Her eyes were filled with tears. She was grateful to see her son again. At least one of her 2 missing children came back. A few years ago, the family went through some major hardships. Ace's older brother, Silas, was killed by a giant bird living on the island. Another brother, Dak, had passed away from an unknown disease, and Mia went missing with no sign of her whereabouts. That misery left Ina and Ace as the only children in the family. However, the hope of finding Ina remained ambiguous.
Oh, son! You have no idea how happy I am right now. I've been praying to the holy mountain every second of the day. I knew it would protect you from any danger. I hope the mountain brings back your sister too,
Janet exclaimed. She hugged her son, wrapping her arms around him. At that moment, her arms clenched him a fraction tighter, and Ace breathed more slowly, feeling the pain everywhere. As her eyes glimmered with watery tears, she continued, I wouldn't forgive myself if I put you in such great danger. Janet was a little plump and tall, but much shorter than her husband. Most of the time she helped Pax in the school. They passed the dome-shaped houses made of thick stones that protected them against severe storms and unpredictable weather. Heads popped out of the windows, and all eyes watched them. They arrived at his house. Raxon, still bracing Ace, put him on the bed, and went to the curious crowd outside the house. We must go. Ace needs some time alone, Raxon informed the crowd. He is too exhausted. He needs some time to rest. We should keep looking for Ina. Meanwhile, Janet came and sat next to her son's bed. She had cleaned his wounds when her husband arrived home with Zine. He was short and overweight, with a long tongue. He had a large head and a round face with tiny yellow eyes that had vertical black pupils, all of which spoke of a kind nature. He knew more than anyone else about illnesses and treatments, but some of the diseases he couldn't heal, or better to say, most of them. She stood aside and let the doctor look. Zine repeated the words Jackson had said earlier. You're lucky, boy. No one has ever survived the sea explosion except you. He asked him what happened, but just as before, Ace preferred not to share information about the secret cave. Instead, he just shook his head and replied with a smile. I fainted, and I don't know what exactly happened. As you said, I was lucky. Zine examined his cuts and noticed the semi-healed marks on his body, which made him a little doubtful. But he preferred not to ask more questions. In general, he didn't talk too much. Ace's index finger was broken, and the knuckle was smashed, causing him to lose all the scales. To make a splint, Zine limited movement by putting pieces of sticks around the finger. Don't use your right hand for at least 2 weeks, and rest. The broken finger will mend fast if you don't move it. And don't worry about your scales. You are young, and your skin will recover. Zine turned to Janet and continued. Dab the cuts with this mud paste 3 times a day, and please, don't send him out to the sea for... Do you think he'll be ready for school? Pax interrupted. He will if he rests and eats well. That is all he does. Zine stood up with a smile, and Ace's father accompanied him. They sat outdoors under the sun.
I thought I lost Ace, like my other kids. Despite Ina, he is naive and young, Pax said, and heaved a deep sigh. We're losing more people each day. My daughter, the best hunter, the most proficient fighter among all the cities, is still missing. Neither I nor anyone else believes she is dead.
Right? Pax looked at Zine, expecting his confirmation. Zine stared at the hammock swinging by the breeze and let the words sink in.
The number of missing people is increasing. I believe something fishy is going on. Because of that you built the school, didn't you?
Zine broke the silence. Both heads tilted toward the 3 instructors who just arrived.
Sorry, Pax. We searched everywhere. There is no sign of your daughter. But we found the body of one of the fishermen. He was battered by rocks and his face eaten by the fish, Patrick said, placing his hands on his head. When Ina arrived at the cliff, the huge wave, as tall as the mountain, approached behind Ace's boat. She didn't know if her brother had received the instruction. But the boat floated there without Ace, and of course, the massive wave in the background got closer to swallow the boat, cliff, jungle, and anything on the way. The water shrank under the cliff to accumulate to the only wave. Ina dived without knowing what else to do. She scanned everywhere, checked the rocks and any possible spot. She saw Ace grasping a large rock. His head swung in the opposite direction, and his face flattened to the stone. Ina felt relieved and looked for a shelter for herself. The notch at the bottom part of the cliff created a safe place to harbor. The plan had just formed in her mind when she saw a large creature spinning and turning toward her, completely out of control and brought by the wave. At first Ina, then the enormous fish, and then the broken stones hit the cliff's base. The massive figure smashed her. A few seconds later, her motionless body floated in the water. Again, the water near the cliff shrank and the second wave approached. It was not as strong as the first one, but still unruly and wild, and threw her out of the water to the mountainside.